Well, good evening again to each of you. I've gotten to say hello to at least most of you, I think, and if I haven't gotten to say hi to you, hopefully I can let that happen after services over tonight. But we want you to know how much we appreciate you coming. We have a number of guests with us, some from the local area, and we have others who have driven from several miles away. We want you to know how much we appreciate you coming. I know you're an encouragement to me, and I'm confident that you're an encouragement to others who have come tonight to be with us as well. It's good that we can attend the meetings of other congregations. I hope that that's something you do on a regular basis. Those of you who regularly worship here, I hope you go and visit other congregations, because that is a great source of encouragement to them. And I'm confident that you do, so thank you for doing that as well. Turn to Joshua 24. We're going to look at something from that passage in just a moment, from that chapter, so I hope you'll take your Bibles and turn there. I had dinner tonight at Kim's house, and I had to cross the river to make that happen. Now, I live in a place where we have the Tennessee River, you have the Ohio River. They're both pretty nice rivers. But where I live, when you cross the river, people on the other side think that people on the other side are bad people. They call it the evil side. But you know, I don't know how y'all do that, how y'all feel about that here, but I found some pretty nice people in Indiana. I just did. I'll just let you know. So I think Kentucky and Indiana both have good people. So I just wanted y'all to know that. I don't think anybody's evil. I like being on both sides of the river. I just want to get that out there so y'all would know how I felt about that. Well, I want to talk to you tonight about something that I think is critically important, and that's our families. In my judgment, raising children is both the most awesome responsibility that I have, and it's the most frightening responsibility that I have. Now, my kids are all gone. They're out of my house, but I'm still raising them. And I think to a degree they would agree with what I'm saying about that. One's 35, one's 33, and one's 30. But as Beth and I, as we think about what we've done, there are things that we did raising our children that we wish we could go back and change. But of course, there are no mulligans when you raise kids. It's what you do, and you move on. But we do think there are some things that we may have done that appear to have had some good result. And so this sermon, to some degree, has something to do with both some things that we personally have seen that we felt like we did good and we felt like we did bad. But all of it has to do with what I believe are biblical principles. And I just want to help you tonight think about three things specifically from the Old Testament that help us understand maybe good ways to think about raising kids. When I first started preaching, I had a sermon, and the sermon was titled, How to Raise Spiritually Minded Children. And then I had kids. So I changed the title of my sermon to Suggestions That I Think the Bible Makes About Raising Kids. And so I just quit titling sermons like this because I didn't want anybody to think that I had all these great ideas, even biblically, about what to do with kids. But here's what I do know. That certainly back home where I preach on a regular basis, and when I have opportunities to go to other places and preach, the most sought after information, and basically what the people are asking for is, can you preach something about the family? Can you talk to us something about the family? And I know why that is. Because as a father or a mother or a grandfather or a grandmother, I know how important that is. And every one of you tonight who is in the process of raising children or have raised children or know somebody who's doing that, I know what's going through your mind. You're thinking about situations in which you're saying, that is a difficult thing. But yet it is something that must be done. So that's why tonight we want to talk about those kind of things. So I just want to make some suggestions that I think are biblically based, maybe that can help us through all this as we think about what I'm going to call it tonight, this idea of as for me and my house. I think I called it something different to flyer. That's what happens to me. I change it about, I think you're going to get every lesson that the flyer says you're going to get. That rarely happens when I go somewhere. I'm just here to tell you. I may say that's what I want to do, and I'll get up here and I'll change my mind. I don't know why I told you that. I guess I just felt obligated to do that. But you're getting everything that's been advertised, and I hope that something sticks. Let's put it that way. This context of Joshua 24, the context is basically God has given Israel rest after conquering Canaan. Joshua's old. He's older now. He's of age. And he's about to leave, and he gives some final advice to the children of Israel. And I think it's interesting advice. I don't want really to start there as he challenges Israel. Verse 15 of Joshua 24 says this, "And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." We're going to come back to that in just a minute. And the response of the children of Israel was this. So the people answered and said, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord God to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is He who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who did those great signs among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out from before us all the people, including the Amorites who dwelt in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for He is our God." Now that's a very positive response to what Joshua had said about what he wanted he and his family to do. So you go on in verse 24, the people said to Joshua, "The Lord our God we will serve, and His voice we will obey." So there's reinforcement about what they said they would do, especially in reference to what Joshua said. And even as you close this particular chapter, the text tells us that Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had known all the works of the Lord which He had done for Israel. So that's the end result. I mean, it had turned out real good. And part of the reason why was because Joshua was such a leader. Not just with what he said to Israel, but apparently he was a leader with what he did with his own family. And I want you to go back with me and just look at what he says in verse 15. I find this a very interesting statement. I don't know, as you've read this through the years, what you've thought about what Joshua said, but I want you to think about this tonight. He said, as he's offering this challenge to the children of Israel, he says, "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Is there anything about that statement that strikes you oddly? When you hear it recorded that Joshua said that about himself and his family, is there anything interesting about the statement that strikes you in maybe an odd kind of way? To me, there is. I'm going to share that with you as we get into this lesson. I think it's interesting that even as the leader of his family, Joshua said, "As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord." That's an emphatic statement. Could you say that if you're the leader of your household? If you're a man who has a family tonight, could you make that statement and mean it? And what did Joshua mean by that statement? Here's my thought about that statement. Here's why that statement's odd to me. I think Joshua could clearly say, "As for me, I'm going to follow the Lord. But as for my house, that's going to be up to them." My understanding of this passage is, and what he's saying is, as for me, I'm going to follow God. And to the best of my ability as the leader of this family, I'm going to see to it that the rest of my family follows God as well. But that's going to be their decision. And isn't it true? Like last night, I'm talking to a group of people who, when you consider your family, you're probably thinking, some of my family follows God. Some of my family doesn't follow. And I know that's a concern to you. And the responsibility, it seems, that Joshua says he had, and the responsibility that I have not only over my children, but over my life in the sense that I'm trying to influence her, is the sense to say, to the best of my ability, I'm going to see to it that my children and my spouse and maybe extended family over whom I have some influence, I'm going to do my very best to see to it that what I give them is what I ought to give them. Then what they do with that is their business. And that's the way it has to be. I can't make my kids do anything that I want them to do. Not now. There was a time when I had a rule and a right, and I had, as we even talked about Sunday, I had some level of authority to say, as your father, this is what I expect, and this is what I want you to do, and this is what I'm asking you to do. This is really what I'm making demands of. But all of you know in that transition at some point, I can no longer make demands. I can try to morally persuade them. I can ask them. I can say, would you think about doing this? And would you make good and honest and profitable decisions for you? And hopefully they will do that. But I can't make them do it. Joshua said, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And apparently that's what happened. Now, here's what I want to talk about for the remainder of this lesson. What did he do? I think he followed what Moses, or what God had commanded through Moses that told us in Deuteronomy. This is a very simple lesson. But I think that when we preach and when we talk about some things we can do to help our family, and to grow our families and our spiritual houses and our spiritual families. I think when we make these things simple, so that we can remember those, we can keep them at the forefront of our minds. And that's what I want us to do with these 3 points that I'm going to make for you tonight. So I hope you'll follow along with me. Deuteronomy 6, the text says, now this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you're crossing over to possess. Remember, that's what they were doing. That you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all His statutes and His commandments which I command you, you and your son and your grandson, all the days of your life. So what the Israelites were told is, these commands and these things that we want to help you understand, these are not only for you, they're for your sons and they're for your grandsons. In other words, they're for generations that follow. So what did they actually say? What is it that a parent was told to do? If you're a parent, you want help. If you're a parent, you want someone to say, this is what I suggest you do. Well, tonight, what I'm about to share with you is what I suggest you do. So let's talk about those things. In Deuteronomy 6, the text tells us that Moses said, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words, I can't read it again, Brent. These words which I command you today shall be in your heart. Let me tell you the first thing you've got to do as a parent. And if I had to prioritize these 3 things, this would be at the top. You have to show your children what God wants. You as a mother and you as a father, you need to love God with all your heart. That's the best way to teach your children, is to show them who they need to be. I don't care if you're talking about children. If you want to have influence over anybody, the best influence that you can be is the best teacher that you can be, and that is to say, look at me, not because of who I am, but because of what I'm trying to be in reference to what God wants. Look at me. And I'm not saying that you do that in some arrogant kind of way, but if you want your children to be what they need to be, you need to show them what they need to be. And that's the most critical thing you can do. So practically, I want to ask you this question. If you are a father and you have sons, I want you to think about where you are in your spiritual life right now. You may be older, you may be younger. But anybody can answer this question, and anybody can apply to really any circumstance. But here's my question. Would you want, let's say a father is 40 years old. Let's say he has sons that are somewhere in there, maybe 20 or below. As a father who's 40 years old, would you want your sons to be you when they're your age? I want you to think about it. I want you to think about that objectively. I want you to think about that honestly. I want you to say to yourself, I can honestly answer that with a yes I do or no I don't. And I hope that every one of you who are fall into that category and have any kind of influence over those who are younger, I hope you can say, you know what? I would be fine with my son being who I am when he's old enough to be as old as I am. I think that's one of the most sobering questions we can ask ourselves. There's a lot to say about loving the Lord God with all of your heart. We're going to talk a little about how principles evolve. We're going to deal with that at least initially tomorrow night when we talk about are we carrying our cross daily. But the very first thing we've got to do is show our children. You know, I think there are a lot of parents. I don't know of a parent who's spiritually minded who wouldn't say, I want my children to be strong spiritually. Even parents who are weak spiritually want their kids to be strong spiritually. But I will tell you that if you're not strong, it doesn't mean that your children can't be strong, but it does mean that there's less of a chance that your children are going to be what they ought to be because you're not what you ought to be. I don't know how you feel about that. But if you're not what you ought to be, I hope you're squirming in your seat. I hope you're saying to yourself, man, that hit me square in the eyes. Because it's a great question to ask. Or if you're a mother, and you have daughters, put it in the same kind of category. Would you want your daughter to be who you are spiritually at the age you are now? Or would you want someone who's younger, whether she's your daughter or not? But every time you look at a young lady, would you say, I would like it to be fine with me if she's who I am when she's my age? And then work towards showing them each and every day who God wants them to be. But show them. I think that's the absolutely most critical thing we can do. That's what Moses said. The Lord has to be in your heart first. That's what he says. It shall be in your heart today. And if it's not going to be in your heart, listen, my friends, don't expect it to be in your kids' hearts. I'm not suggesting that it can't be. But my word, it makes it so much harder. You really want to give a benefit to your children spiritually, which I know everybody does. And I would say that everybody in this audience tonight would say, no, that's my priority. My priority is my kids. Or my priority is my grandkids. Or my priorities are those over whom I have some influence. If that is the case, then the priority in your life is to make your life what it ought to be. So that people see that. That'll speak volumes to you. Then the second thing that I would suggest to you is this. If you turn over to Deuteronomy 6, beginning in verse 7, I've got to turn around and make sure I can read this. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You should talk with them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlet between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. You got to teach them. And let me say what I'm about to say about that right at the beginning. And then I'm going to move off in a different direction. If all your kids, the only teaching that your kids get is by listening to this dear brother at 7 o'clock every morning for a few minutes, that's going to help them. to get it done. I've listened to Brandon since I've been here. Kathy, make sure. Kathy and Cheryl, we all listen. And I think it's great. But if that's all they're getting, and hopefully they're getting that, if they're not, they ought to be, or what they get in a class here at the building a couple of times. Listen, mamas and daddies, if that's all they get, that ain't going to cut it. I'm abusing the King's English, but you get my point. If that's all they're getting, that's not going to get it done. You have to teach them. Moses said, God said, you need to teach them diligently. And I think what he's trying to say is this is a 24/7 job. This is not something that happens a couple of hours on Sunday and possibly Wednesday night, or something that happens every morning for a few minutes. What he's saying is it's 24/7. It's a teaching process that takes their whole lives. Now here's the hard one. That's hard to do. But I'm going to remind you, it's what you signed up for. When you had children, that's exactly what you signed up for. Let me tell you something. If you're unwilling to teach your children, I'm going to tell you what I believe the Lord calls it. I believe He calls it sin. It's a responsibility that a mother and a father has. And I believe the lead in that has to be the father because of his leadership position. Now, there's all sorts of applications about that. And I think one of those applications is he needs to take the lead in how his children are taught. Simply because he is the father. And according to Ephesians 6, it seems to me that's an obligation that he has to see that his children are brought up, they're raised, they're nurtured, they're instructed in the admonition of the Lord, that they're taught about those kind of things. And if you're a father here tonight and you're not doing that, start doing that. Now, that passage doesn't tell you how. It just says do it. Years ago, I've told this story, I don't know, 100 times. And I tell it because it just made such an impression. Years ago, I was traveling through Dothan, Alabama. That's in the southern part of the state. And I spent the night with a family, John and Becky Haley. John is a retired orthopedic surgeon. But at the time, this is probably 30, 35 years, or maybe even longer than that. But I spent the night in their house, and I stayed in John Jr.'s room. His room was upstairs. He had twin beds. John was in one. John Jr. was in the bed. I was in the bed, and I slept that night. And the next morning, about 6, I heard some sweet voice come over the PA system. That's not the PA system. Amplification system. It's one of those speakers that you had back in the day. And I heard somebody say, "John, you and Kenny need to get up." And I was on my left side, and I was facing the wall. John was in a twin bed here. And when I heard her voice, it woke me up, and I kind of looked at my watch, and I thought, it's 6 o'clock. I'm not going to bed. She said, "John and Kenny, you need to get up." I'm thinking, get up for what? I'd have to be anywhere at 10. I'm thinking, I'd get ready in less than 4 hours. So I just played possum, and I just kept lying. And John did too. And in about a couple of minutes, I heard somebody's voice, "Are you boys up?" And I still act like I did, and I heard John get out of bed behind me, and he came over and he kind of did this to my back. And I kind of shuffled like I just woke up. Like I didn't hear his mother call us out the first couple of times. And little John said, "Kenny, we got to get up." I thought, I'm thinking, it's 6:10. What are you getting up for? And I asked him, I said, "John, what are you getting up for?" He said, "Well, we got to go to school." He said, "Dad's got to go to the hospital." And I'm thinking, okay, that's not me, and that's not you. I don't have to go to the hospital. He said, "We have devotion every morning at 6:15. I'm thinking, well, if they have devotion, Kenny's going to have a devotion. So I got up, and I went downstairs, and I sat with those 4 kids. And I can tell you, I remember it just like it happened yesterday. Those 4 kids, they weren't any more pleased with being down there at 6:15 than I was. They listened to their daddy. And I never will forget, we had a short devotion of about 10 minutes, and John talked to his children about, from Acts 16 and Timothy being well spoken of by the brethren. I never will forget it. I had a sermon that I preached on. And for about 10 minutes, John sat with his children, and Becky stopped with the breakfast, and she sat down. And all 7 of us sat there and listened to John Haley talk to these kids about what it meant to be well spoken about people. He gave a great lesson on reputation. When it was over, I said, John Jr., I said, John, I said, how often y'all do this? He said, every weekday. He said, we take Sunday off. And I thought, well, at least you get Sunday off. You know, you're going to get it someplace. And I wasn't being negative about it. I just didn't want to get up at 6 o'clock. And I said, do you do that every week? Every weekday. Now, the reason I tell you that story is this. I wish you knew John Haley's kids now. Some of you probably do. John Jr. is now an elder. Their daughter Tracy is married to Russ Bolton, who's a preacher. Probably some of you know. Their daughter Tim, or their son Tim, is an orthopedic surgeon and is an elder in the church there. And their other daughter Margaret married a man who's an elder in the church in Athens, Alabama. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you start having devotions every weekday at 6 a.m., that's what's going to happen to your kids. I'm not saying that. Here's what I'm saying. John Haley decided that's how he was going to help teach his kids. And that's what he did. Consistently. Now, I know what your next question is going to be. Kenny, what did you do? We didn't get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I can promise you that. And I will also tell you that one of my regrets is that I didn't do more to help teach my children in my home as the leader of my family. I did some things. We had some devotions. We didn't have them regularly in terms of every day. But we didn't have them, as I look back, as regularly as I would have liked. Now, I'm thankful that my children, and who my children are now spiritually. But if I could go back, there'd be some things I'd change. What should you do? I don't know. But I know you should do something. I don't know what to tell you about. I don't find anything in Scripture that says, here's how you teach your children. Now, I find some principles that are laid out that say, here's some things you ought to help teach your children. But I don't find anything that turns about format or method or frequency. I don't find anything about it. But you need to give some thought to what you are going to do, and then do what it is that you've given that kind of thought. And let me reinforce what I just said. That needs to start with a daddy, not a mom. So daddies, that needs to start with you. You need to think about what you're doing. Let your wife, let their mother help you, because she is such an integral part. Oh my word, I can't imagine my life and my family without my wife. But it's so critical that we teach them. And we find ways to do that. When they rise up, when they lie down, when they go out, when they come in. All sorts of opportunities to teach our kids. May I say something that everybody here knows? It's just so hard to do that. Because the world's not going to do that. Matter of fact, the world's going to try to wreak havoc on what your kids know. They're going to do just the opposite in most of the time. Not every time. Not in every case. But please take the time to teach them. Make a deliberate choice. This is what we're going to do. And then finally, let me say this. You need to tell them. You need to tell them what God's done for you. You need to tell them and show them what God's done for you. They need to see the value of, this is why we live like we live. this is why we serve who we serve. This is why our allegiance is to Jesus Christ, because of what it gives us. Deuteronomy 6. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, what's the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments which the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, and the Lord showed signs and wonders before our eyes, great and severe against Egypt, Pharaoh and all his household. Then he brought us out from there, that he might bring us in, to give us the land of which he swore to our fathers. And the Lord commended us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive, as it is this day. Then it will be righteousness for us, if we are careful to observe all these commandments before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. You need to tell your kids what God's done for you in your life. Can you imagine not having God in your life? Can you imagine trying to determine how you need to live your life by yourself? Oh, this is how I need to live my life. Can you imagine not having this great book and this great Savior to help us understand, no, this is how I need to live my life. And this is what I need to tell my children. God has brought us out. He may not have brought us out of the land of Egypt, but he's brought us out of the land of bondage. And as we talked about earlier in other lessons from Romans 6, he saved us. And he's created a new heart in us, and he's made us a new creature. He's caused us to be raised up. And he's changed our lives. And that needs to be seen by our children. If your children and your grandchildren can't see that the Lord's made a difference in your life, that's problematic. That's problematic. We need to do what we can to help them see what God has done for us. You make one other point about that. The text says in verse 20, when your son asks you in time to come, say. And I want to talk just briefly about it. Your children ought to ask you questions. I think there have been times in the past when, not everyone, but I think that sometimes generations of the past have expected children just to learn from rote what it is that they're supposed to know. And sometimes when that might have been questioned, and the answer is just simply, well, you ought to know that. You've been taught that. It's not good enough anymore. I don't believe it was good enough then. Some of the best things that have happened to me in my life is my kids come to me and say, Dad, I know what we do. I know what we believe. But why? It's a great teaching opportunity. And in the Old Testament, in verse 20, the text says, when your son asks you in time to come, say. There are interrogative words like what and why and how and when and which. And the text in Hebrew goes on to say the testimonies and statutes and judgments which the Lord our God has commanded you. In other words, they're going to ask you questions about why it is that you want them to believe what you want them to believe and why you want them to believe what God said. There are questions about that. In the Hebrew, it's written like this. When your son asks you right to left, saying in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimony? You see that? I'm not a big Hebrew scholar, but I can read a little bit of it, especially with somebody else. But that's the question, you see. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, what? You see that word right there, that Hebrew word, M-A-H? That's a word that in the Hebrew, when each of those interrogatives are asked, that's the word that appears in the text. I'm showing that to you because the Lord expected your children to ask you questions. And one thing that I have learned through my personal experience is that's going to happen. You better be ready for those questions. questions. And not only have you better be ready for the questions, you better be ready with biblical, solid, good answers that are reasonable. That's the word. So when your son asks you the time to come say, what kind of questions? What's going to be some of the questions they may ask? What's the breadth of the question? Why? Why do these things? Why so many? Do we have to do those things? Do we have to do all those things? That doesn't make any sense to me. What sense does that make about that? Are all the details important? Do they all matter? That's not what I expected. That's not what I would have done. That's not what I would have decided. You're going to sometimes get these kind of questions. Or, well, there's many people. There are educated people. There's sincere people. There are different kinds of people. They don't do that. I know what we do. I know what happens on Sunday. I know what happens on Wednesday. I know what we teach about this or you teach about this. I understand it. But that's not what most people do. And they're educated people. They're not stupid. Matter of fact, Dad, Mom, they're more religious than a lot of people we go to church with. And I will tell you, there's a lot of truth to that. There's a whole lot of truth to that. These are the questions. And when our kids ask us, we've got to have good, solid, biblical answers. Let me give you an illustration. I don't have time to get into it. I just want to give you an illustration. Because among young people, this is big. Why can't we use the instrument? That's big. It's huge. There are more and more kids ask the question. A lot of us sitting here going, man, we talked about that for years. Just get back to that authority. We could talk about instrumental music for years. And I've heard people say, well, that's just not what we do in Church of Christ. That's the worst answer I've ever heard in my entire life. I'm not saying that's not even a true statement all through. Or I've heard this answer, well, there's 9 verses in the New Testament, and all of them talk about sin. That's just proof text. That's not a good argument, in my judgment. Does it have some reasonableness to it to have an effect on what I mentioned? Yes. It shows what people in the first century did. I think it's interesting that as I read the New Testament, I don't find anything else. I don't find anything in about the use of the instrument. Not in the New Testament. Now, I'm not here to elaborate on what I think the better arguments are, but I think sometimes we make poor arguments. And when I say we, I don't like using we terms or us terms. I just don't like that because I may not feel like you do. You may not feel like that. It's better for me to say, I don't do this or I don't do that, or I don't think this or I don't think that, or I don't believe this or I do. That's a better way for me to argue. Here's one. For your children, or your grandchildren come to you. And in my case, when my 3-year-old grandson, in a few years, comes to me, he says, Coach, that's what he calls me. He said, Coach, I got a friend, they play piano at their church. Can you help me understand why we don't play the piano at our church? I better be ready. Good. With a good, solid, biblical argument. I'm not saying we don't make good arguments. What I'm saying is we don't make good arguments all the time. And as a father, and as a leader, and as a mother, who has children who are going to ask questions. They're going to ask the what, the why, and the how, and the when. They're going to ask. You better have good answers. Why? The Lord's commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our being all. It's for our good. I don't want you to be who I am. I don't want you to be who the Lord wants you to be because it's just a good way to live life. No, it's the very best thing for you to do. Young person, if you're here tonight and you're trying to figure out, should I be a Christian? Yes! Anything less is going to be bad for you. Listen carefully to me. I may sound like I'm mad. I'm not mad. I just want to make sure you hear this. Being who God wants you to be is the very best thing for you. And anything less than that is not good. You may not want to hear it. Or you may not want to hear it now, but you need to hear it. Parents, you need to help your child, your son or your daughter hear it. You need to tell them it's for your good. It's for your good. Now I got one final point in lesson 3. Don't give up. Somebody rang the bell on me and shut me down. I want to tell you a quick story. I was preaching on a lesson similar to this in South Jacksonville, Florida, years ago. And I made a point or two. I don't know if it was this sermon or something similar to this. I preached the lesson. I got back home. About 3 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. Y'all remember what that is? A letter in the mail had a stamp on it. Usually white. You go to the post office, you open it, read it. I got a letter. I opened the letter. This guy said, Kenny, I want you to know something. He said, I remember the lesson that you preached the last night of the meeting. And he said, it made me think about something. I said, and he, in the letter, he said, I want to share with you. He said, I thought it would be good for you to hear what happened. He said, I had a son who lives in Portland, Oregon. He's in Jacksonville. This man's in Jacksonville. His son lived in Portland, Oregon. Now, if you know anything about geography, here's Jacksonville, Florida. Here's Portland, Oregon. It's about as far from each other as you can get. That didn't have anything to do with the story, but I just thought that did. And he said, I made a decision. He said, I realized I hadn't been what I ought to be. I said, that. I hadn't been spiritually minded, but I should be. He said, so I made a decision I was going to go see my son. He hadn't gone, as far as I knew, for about 6 years, he hadn't even gone to a church building or assembly with people. He showed a little interest in spiritual things, but he said, I made a decision. I bought a round-trip plane ticket from Jacksonville, Florida to Portland, Oregon. The turnaround time was 6 hours. He said, I hadn't seen my son for 6 years. But he said, before I made the reservation, he said, I called my daughter-in-law and asked her to make sure that my son would be home those hours when I was going to be there. I didn't tell her why. I just said, would you make sure he's home? And she said, yes. She said, we'll be glad to see him, but certainly I'll make sure he's home. She didn't tell her husband, his son. So this man flew to Portland, Oregon, knocked on the front door, and his son saw him, and of course it shocked him. He didn't know Dad was coming. And he said, Dad, I'm so glad to see you. He said, really good. It kind of surprised me this year. He said, well, I knew it would, but I'm here for a specific reason. He said, well, great, he said, how long are you going to be here? He said, a couple hours. And he shocked his son. He's like, you flew all the way up here, spent 2 hours up here with my family, and you're going back home. He said, yes, that's right. He said, now I may come back later, but he said, I came for one purpose. And he said, if you don't mind, I'd like where you sit down and hear me out. I said, sure. So he sat down with his son, not his family, not his daughter-in-law or his grandkids, just with his son. And the gist of what he said in the letter was this. He said, I told my son, I said, I love you. I love you more than anything else on earth. I love your wife. I love your grandkids. But I made mistakes with you. I failed you in some ways. And I think it's cost you some things. And basically what the man did was to say that I've neglected you spiritually. I'm asking for your forgiveness. And I'm hopeful and I'm prayerful that in the time to come, that you'll give some consideration to making your life something that my life wasn't when I was your age. For your sake and for the sake of your children. And in the letter, he said, my son responded favorably, but he didn't say what he was going to do. He just said, Dad, it means the world to me that you come up here and tell me this. And he said, I'll consider it. I'll talk to my wife about it. We'll think about it. He said, Kenny, I'm writing you this letter because I got a call from my son. And he said, Dad, we're going to start going to church. And we're going to start trying to help our kids understand what they need to be because we understand what we need to be. Now, I realize what I've told you is the best case scenario. I get that. And I don't get many of those letters at all. But here's what that man said at the end of the letter. He said, I'm writing this to tell you, to tell people, don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. And the reason that I make this point in these sermons is because I'm always talking to people who struggle because of what they've done or not done in the past. My point to this lesson tonight is not to make you feel better. My point to this lesson is to encourage you to feel better. And to do what you can. Even if it appears as though what you've done has been a failure as a parent, or what you've done may not have worked. Maybe you've tried and it's just not produced what you wanted. Don't stop trying. Don't stop trying. Because what you and your family have to gain is the greatest blessing they can have. I'll do a favor if you do me. I'll pray for you. You pray for me. That those who may not have yet to be the kind of people they need to be would be touched in some way by things that we might do. And tonight, if I could just say to you, if there's somebody that you need to have a talk with in a loving, careful, productive kind of way, for their sakes and yours, have the conversation. May God bless what we talked about tonight. If you're in this audience tonight, you're not a Christian, Ronnie's going to lead us in a meditation song. If there's a spiritual need, you can help us. We beg you to come while we stand.